He thought he was in charge. A fake HOA security guard with a badge from the internet and an ego the size of Texas. When he pulled a gun on my daughter, over a so-called violation, he didn't realize she was trained to handle hostage situations for the FBI. One command, and he was eating pavement. This wasn't just about one man's stupidity, it was about exposing the dangerous power some people think they have when nobody holds them accountable. In the quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood of Westfield Oaks, nestled just outside a bustling city, life was supposed to be simple. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and neatly painted mailboxes gave the illusion of peace and order. But beneath the surface, a growing tension had been brewing for months, ever since the Homeowners Association decided to upend its usual operations. It began subtly at first, more warning letters in mailboxes, new signs about yard decorations, and neighborhood meetings that suddenly weren't so neighborly anymore. The HOA board, a small group of self-important residents with too much time and not enough empathy, had recently passed a series of arbitrary rules. They called them quality of life improvements, but to most residents, they felt more like targeted harassment. People whispered about HOA members taking offense at kids' bicycles left on sidewalks, or lawn chairs not matching the approved aesthetic. It was the kind of rulebook that could turn a friendly community into a pressure cooker. Then came the decision that truly shifted the atmosphere, hiring a private security company to patrol the neighborhood. Not local law enforcement. Not trained community liaisons. Just a vague group of so-called guards from a barely known agency, outfitted with uniforms designed to intimidate, not to protect. They drove unmarked vehicles with flashing lights and wore badges that looked legitimate at a glance but didn't hold any real authority. Most residents were skeptical at first, but some feared pushing back. The HOA claimed it was for safety. They cited vague statistics about rising thefts and car break-ins, though no one could remember a single incident in recent months. In reality, the guards mostly drove around issuing warnings for unauthorized guests, extended parking, and improper landscaping. They had no legal jurisdiction, no formal training beyond a few weeks of online courses, and no de-escalation skills. But they carried themselves like they were the law. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to change. Elderly residents who once waved to everyone now watched cautiously through their curtains. Parents walking kids to school noticed the patrol cars trailing them slowly. Some even reported being questioned, politely, but firmly, about where they lived and what they were doing. The so-called security presence created more fear than comfort. Tension came to a head when one of the guards, a man named Travis, began making himself known in the worst possible way. Broad-shouldered with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, he made a habit of parking his SUV at the neighborhood entrance like a checkpoint. He'd stop delivery drivers, stare down teenagers, and call out to residents who took a little too long getting their groceries from the car. He acted like a cop, even though he wasn't one. What made it worse was the HOA's silence. Complaints were brushed off, emails went unanswered, and anyone who brought it up at meetings was accused of being anti-community. Travis was emboldened by their approval, or at least their lack of discipline. He began going beyond writing warnings. He started threatening citations that didn't exist. He walked up to porches with his hand resting on his belt, the bulge of a holstered firearm always visible. It wasn't illegal, he had a permit, but it was deeply unsettling. Many residents tried to avoid confrontation. Some installed cameras. Others told their children not to speak to the man in the black SUV. But people talked. Word spread quickly about a woman who had been shouted at for blocking the road while unloading groceries, and a young black teenager who had been followed halfway down the street before being told to go back where he came from, despite living in the neighborhood his entire life. There was a growing sense that things were spiraling, that the guard's authority was unchecked and entirely manufactured, but still somehow dangerous. Into this environment came the narrator's daughter. She was visiting for a few days, taking time off from a demanding and often dangerous career in federal law enforcement. She wasn't in uniform, wasn't driving a government vehicle, and wasn't looking for trouble. She had simply flown home to see her family and enjoy a brief moment of normalcy. But she stepped into a neighborhood that no longer felt normal. She arrived late afternoon, her black SUV rolling quietly into the driveway like any other guests. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a hoodie, sneakers. Nothing about her presence would signal her rank, her training, or her role as an FBI tactical commander. To the untrained eye, she looked like any young professional woman dropping in to see her parents. She hadn't been home in months and had no idea how much the neighborhood had changed since the last time she was there. The moment she parked, an uneasy shift seemed to ripple through the street. Travis had been on patrol that afternoon. He had seen her drive in. And like a predator mistaking strength for weakness, he zeroed in. The SUV didn't have the HOA-issued resident parking sticker. That alone, in his mind, was cause for confrontation. Never mind the fact that guest vehicles were allowed. Never mind that she was parked in her own parents' driveway. Travis didn't care about facts, he cared about control. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. He had stopped contractors, friends, babysitters, even Amazon drivers. He relished opportunities to confront people who didn't immediately defer to him. But this time would be different. This time, he picked the wrong target. And the HOA, in its silent complicity, had no idea what was about to unfold. What had started as a misguided attempt to increase security was about to explode into a scandal that would shake the entire community. Because when you give authority to people who haven't earned it, and then let them act without consequences, sooner or later, they cross the wrong line. Or, in this case, the wrong woman. The confrontation began not with sirens or shouting, but with an entitled swagger and a sense of misplaced power. Travis, the self-appointed enforcer of a private neighborhood, had spotted what he believed was another violator, another outsider daring to ignore his authority. The sleek black SUV parked confidently in the driveway didn't match the typical resident vehicles. It lacked the HOA's mandatory decal, and to him, that was enough to trigger a response. He pulled his patrol car to a hard stop just across the street, engine idling, lights off, but his presence unmistakable. He sat there for several minutes, watching. Not observing with professionalism, but scrutinizing like a man looking for trouble. To him, every unknown car, every unfamiliar face, was a threat to his fragile sense of control. And he had decided this situation was no different. When the woman stepped out of the SUV, he noted her calm demeanor and casual dress but didn't take a moment to question whether she belonged. He'd already made up his mind, she was in violation. That's all that mattered. Travis had done this before. He was known for approaching people with aggression masked as authority. His favorite tactic was to demand answers with the cadence of an officer, using phrases like, "You're in violation," or "You're being non-compliant," as though backed by law. But there was no law backing him. Only the illusion of it. Still, the badge on his chest, the holstered weapon, the radio crackling static, it was enough to make most people hesitate. That hesitation was what he counted on. Not facts, not fairness. Just fear. He exited his vehicle with deliberate confidence, adjusting his belt like a man preparing for confrontation. Across the street, neighbors peeked through blinds. Some recognized the posture. Travis had gone into enforcer mode again. No one had the courage to intervene. Not after previous complaints had been dismissed. Not after one resident was told to stay in their lane when they brought up concerns about his behavior at a board meeting. The HOA had empowered him, and now he moved like a man who believed he was untouchable. He crossed the street quickly, stepping onto the property with no hesitation. The driveway wasn't his jurisdiction, but in his mind, the whole neighborhood was. As he approached the woman, his voice rose with assertiveness. He accused her of violating neighborhood parking codes. He claimed guest vehicles had to be registered with the HOA in advance. He cited a rule that didn't exist, referencing page numbers and paragraphs of a handbook he clearly hadn't read in full. His tone was not one of inquiry or conversation, it was an order. The woman, calm and composed, asked him to clarify which policy she had violated. But Travis didn't appreciate questions. In his world, a challenge to his authority was disrespect. Her refusal to immediately comply triggered something in him, a dangerous mix of arrogance and insecurity. He raised his voice, took a step closer, and placed a hand on his holstered weapon, not drawing it yet, but making sure it was seen. It was a tactic he had used before. A subtle but unmistakable show of force. This moment marked the turning point. Up to this point, it had been posturing, bullying with the appearance of legality. But the second his hand touched the weapon in an act of implied threat, the situation escalated beyond mere harassment. It crossed into recklessness. He had no authority to enforce laws. No legal basis for detaining or threatening anyone. And yet, here he was, invoking the gravest power granted to trained professionals, under circumstances where he held no such right. The woman remained composed, but her stance shifted. What Travis failed to recognize was that he hadn't just approached another resident. He had initiated a tactical threat against someone who had faced real gunfire, someone who had disarmed hostiles in high-stakes situations, someone trained not just to respond, but to neutralize. His hand still hovered near his weapon as he barked another threat, this time stating she would be forcibly removed if she didn't comply. He reached for the radio clip to his vest, pretending backup was on its way. But this wasn't a situation for backup. Not the kind he expected. What happened next occurred in seconds, too fast for any bystander to fully register. The calm authority in the woman's voice was immediate and commanding. The tone was not argumentative, it was official, precise, and unshakable. The kind of tone only a federal agent could use under pressure. And in that moment, the power shifted completely. Travis, caught in the middle of his own bluff, was now being confronted by someone whose authority was not only real, but earned through years of service, discipline, and tactical experience. The response was swift and controlled. He never saw it coming. And within moments, the weapon was no longer at his side. It was safely secured. His own body, now flat against the concrete, no longer radiated control, but confusion. The performative image of power he had built in the neighborhood collapsed instantly. There were no excuses he could offer that would erase what had just happened, not with witnesses watching and cameras capturing everything. Neighbors emerged cautiously, phones in hand. Some had recorded the entire incident from the moment he stepped out of his car. What they saw wasn't a woman resisting authority, it was a federal officer responding with restraint and skill to a man who had no right to draw a weapon. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had spent months pretending to be law enforcement had finally met someone who actually was. And he had no idea. Within minutes, the local police were called, not by Travis, but by concerned residents. The truth unraveled quickly. The woman calmly presented her credentials. Her identity, her clearance, and her training were all verified without question. The moment her badge was shown, the entire narrative shifted. The silence from the HOA would not protect him this time. There was no way to spin what had occurred. Not with video evidence. Not with a federal agent as the victim. The confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes. But its implications would ripple far beyond that. What began as a petty display of authority over a non-existent rule had turned into a federal-level incident. The man who thought his fake power was enough to control others had just discovered how dangerous and humiliating that illusion could be when confronted by the real thing. The community, once paralyzed by his intimidation, now saw clearly who he really was. And more importantly, who she really was. The aftermath of the confrontation didn't bring the calm many expected. Instead, it ignited a firestorm that would ripple through every part of the community, legal, social, and political. The footage from neighborhood doorbell cameras spread quickly. Within hours, the video made its way onto social media platforms, shared in local forums and group chats. The title alone, "Fake HOA Security Draws Gun on FBI Tactical Commander," was enough to spark outrage. But the footage was worse than the headline. It showed a man in a fake uniform using a real gun to intimidate a woman on her own property. The comments poured in by the thousands, demanding answers and accountability. The woman's identity was not disclosed publicly, but law enforcement insiders and veteran agents recognized the protocol. The composure, the way the weapon was secured, the verbal commands, it was textbook tactical response. Not only had she acted within protocol, she had likely prevented a tragedy. But the fact that it happened at all was disturbing to the public. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a lapse in communication. It was a deliberate escalation by a man who had been allowed to operate unchecked in a residential community, with no oversight and no qualifications. Local news reporters arrived at the gates of Westfield Oaks the next morning. Cameras were rolling as residents were interviewed, many of them finally speaking out about their experiences with the security team. Stories poured out, of intimidation, threats, racial profiling, and harassment. Parents described their children being followed home from the park. Elderly residents shared how they were afraid to walk their dogs at night. The community that once prided itself on safety now became a national example of what happens when private power goes unchecked. The HOA board tried to contain the situation. At first, they issued a brief, impersonal statement calling the incident a misunderstanding and promising an internal review. But that only added fuel to the fire. The word misunderstanding suggested neutrality, as though there were two valid sides to the story. But there weren't. One side had abused power, drawn a weapon, and falsely claimed authority. The other had exercised restraint and followed federal procedure to disarm a threat. The public wasn't buying the HOA's attempt at damage control. Behind the scenes, federal agencies had already begun their own investigation. It wasn't just about the weapon or the confrontation, it was about jurisdiction, impersonation, and potential legal liability. Travis had worn a badge and uniform that implied government affiliation. His company's insignia resembled those used by actual law enforcement, which violated federal laws against impersonating officers. And most damning of all, he had used a firearm in a threatening manner during an unauthorized stop. These weren't minor infractions, they were potential felonies. The private security company he worked for came under immediate scrutiny. Its licensing, training protocols, and hiring practices were reviewed by state regulators. As it turned out, Travis had barely passed the minimum qualifications. He had failed previous psychological evaluations, had no military or law enforcement background, and had received multiple complaints in previous jobs. Yet he had been given a uniform, a badge, and a gun, and told to patrol a neighborhood with virtually no oversight. The company quickly tried to distance itself from him, terminating his contract and releasing a carefully worded statement that he had violated operational standards. But the damage was already done. Civil rights organizations took notice, pointing out that this wasn't just a rogue guard, it was a symptom of a broader issue. Across the country, more and more HOAs and private communities had begun hiring private security forces with little regulation. They dressed like police, acted like police, but weren't held to the same standards. The incident became a case study in the dangers of privatized law enforcement in civilian spaces. It wasn't just a neighborhood scandal, it was a national conversation. Back in Westfield Oaks, the fallout spread quickly. The HOA board was forced to hold an emergency town hall meeting. This time, they couldn't ignore the residents. Dozens of neighbors, many of whom had never attended a single meeting before, showed up demanding answers. They brought emails, screenshots, and testimonies. One by one, they laid out a pattern of abuse, ignored complaints, and a culture of silence. The board president tried to deflect blame, suggesting the guard acted independently. But the residents weren't buying it. They had copies of HOA emails, board minutes, and internal memos showing the board had been fully aware of Travis's behavior for months. The meeting ended in chaos. Residents voted to suspend the current board and called for new elections. Lawyers were brought in. Civil lawsuits were filed, not just against the guard and the security company, but against the HOA itself for negligence and emotional distress. The legal team representing the FBI commander declined to comment publicly, but it was clear that federal involvement wasn't over. The weapon drawn on her was not just a threat to her personally, it was a challenge to the very idea of authority and the misuse of it by those who hadn't earned it. Local lawmakers weighed in, with some proposing legislation to regulate private security forces in residential neighborhoods. There were discussions of minimum training standards, uniform restrictions, and clearer boundaries for HOA enforcement powers. What had started as a single moment in one suburban driveway was now shaping state policy. And in communities across the country, HOAs began quietly reviewing their own contracts and procedures, wary of becoming the next viral headline. The woman at the center of it all never sought the spotlight. She hadn't revealed her role to make a statement or prove a point. She had acted purely out of duty, trained instinct in response to a threat. But her actions spoke louder than any press release. She had reminded the nation that real authority isn't loud or performative. It's earned through service, integrity, and responsibility. And when misused, even by those in fake uniforms, it must be confronted. The image of Travis lying face down on the pavement would become symbolic, not just of one man's fall from delusion, but of the collapse of a system that allowed him to feel powerful in the first place. A man who thought a badge made him immune to consequences had finally learned the hard way. Pretending to be the law is no match for someone who actually lives by it. The weeks that followed brought significant and sweeping changes, not just in the Westfield Oaks community, but in cities and states across the country. The story had grown beyond a local controversy. It had become a rallying point for discussions around community safety, abuse of power, and the blurred lines between private enforcement and real law enforcement. What started as an outrageous act by a self-important security guard had become a catalyst for overdue reform. The FBI's internal investigation concluded with a strong public statement, confirming that their tactical commander had acted appropriately, restrained the suspect without excessive force, and followed protocol. The agency emphasized the importance of distinguishing between lawful authority and impersonation. Their statement underscored that the misuse of law enforcement aesthetics, badges, uniforms, jargon, by untrained private guards could lead to tragic outcomes, especially when those guards wield real weapons under false pretenses. The FBI's unusually strong stance made it clear that they considered the event not just a security concern, but a systemic threat to public trust. Civil rights organizations joined the conversation. Legal scholars and policy advocates used the incident as a case study in public hearings, pointing out the growing number of HOAs and gated communities that rely on poorly vetted private security companies. They demanded regulation, licensing standards, and accountability. Lawmakers in several states responded by drafting new bills aimed at regulating private security enforcement. These proposals included requiring guards to wear clearly distinguishable uniforms, banning them from using law enforcement-style insignia, and mandating training on de-escalation and civil rights. In the state where the incident occurred, the governor ordered a full review of all active private security licenses and contracts. Several companies had their certifications revoked after failing to meet basic standards, and local municipalities began setting up independent oversight committees to handle complaints against private guards. Even homeowners associations came under scrutiny, as it was revealed that some had signed private contracts without any legal consultation, insurance coverage, or background checks. The HOA board at Westfield Oaks had operated without transparency or accountability, and now it faced multiple lawsuits from both current and former residents. National media outlets began producing investigative reports, unearthing similar stories from other neighborhoods, cases where guards had threatened teens, harassed delivery drivers, and racially profiled visitors. Residents began coming forward, empowered by the national attention, and sharing their experiences. Social media movements formed around hashtags calling for the reform or abolition of private security forces in civilian neighborhoods. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated event. It was a warning sign of what happens when power is given without accountability. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the incident, while still keeping her identity mostly private, became a symbol of composure and professionalism. Her colleagues in law enforcement knew her reputation well, but now her actions had reached a wider audience. Without seeking credit or fanfare, she had calmly disarmed a threat and exposed a system failure in the process. Her refusal to use excessive force, even when threatened, became a powerful contrast to the aggressiveness displayed by the fake security guard. In training academies and law enforcement briefings, her conduct was now being studied as a model of restraint and authority under pressure. The HOA, under immense legal and public pressure, was forced to dissolve its contract with the private security company. In its place, residents voted to establish a neighborhood safety council composed of volunteers and elected representatives from within the community. Instead of armed patrols, they invested in better lighting, neighborhood watch training, and direct collaboration with the city's official police department. The new model focused on transparency, community involvement, and communication rather than intimidation. It marked a return to true community-based safety, rooted in trust and mutual respect. Parents began organizing forums and workshops to educate their children about recognizing real law enforcement and understanding their rights. Neighborhood schools introduced programs on civil rights, authority, and public safety. There was a collective realization that safety wasn't about uniforms or firearms, it was about responsibility, empathy, and accountability. These grassroots efforts, sparked by one dangerous encounter, were creating long-term cultural change. The private security company responsible for employing Travis faced multiple lawsuits. Former clients canceled contracts, and industry watchdogs issued warnings. Their lax hiring standards and failure to act on previous complaints became central to the public outrage. Travis himself faced criminal charges for impersonating an officer, brandishing a weapon, and making unlawful threats. His defense attempted to frame the event as a misunderstanding, but the evidence, including video footage and his prior complaints, made that defense crumble. The court's ruling was swift and clear. Travis had abused authority he was never legally entitled to, and he posed a danger to public safety. Westfield Oaks began to heal, though slowly. Formerly divided residents found common ground in their collective demand for reform. Where silence and fear once dominated, conversations were now open and transparent. Residents who had never spoken to each other before were now organizing neighborhood meetings, voter registration drives, and advocacy events. They took pride not in their gates or private patrols, but in their unity and shared voice. Nationally, the conversation around private security took on new urgency. Journalists, lawyers, and lawmakers referenced the Westfield Oaks incident in congressional hearings. It became an example of what needed to change, and proof that change was possible when the public demanded it. Associations of retired police officers called for reforms as well, noting that security roles must never mimic law enforcement unless held to equal standards. In hindsight, many saw the incident as a necessary reckoning. For years, unqualified individuals had been handed power with no supervision. The confrontation in the driveway wasn't just about one man's ego, it was about how institutions enable that ego through negligence, indifference, and denial. But it was also a story of courage. One woman, armed not just with training but with calm and clarity, had faced down that negligence and refused to let it pass unchecked. And in doing so, she helped spark a movement. Not for control, but for reform. Not for punishment, but for protection. And not for fear, but for the rebuilding of public trust. In the months following the incident, the legacy of what happened in Westfield Oaks reached far beyond the community's manicured lawns and decorative gates. It sparked a shift in national consciousness about the unchecked rise of privatized enforcement in residential spaces and the dangerous illusion of authority that came with it. Public awareness campaigns were launched by advocacy groups, urging communities to reconsider how they define safety, and who they trusted to enforce it. A coalition of former law enforcement professionals, civil rights attorneys, and urban planners collaborated to publish a comprehensive policy framework addressing the misuse of private security. Their findings were sobering. Thousands of private security guards across the country operated with minimal training, zero oversight, and access to weapons. Many carried badges that looked indistinguishable from those of legitimate police. The report called for sweeping reforms, mandatory certification, psychological evaluations, continuous training, clearly marked uniforms, and unambiguous boundaries between private enforcement and public law enforcement. The recommendations were adopted in part by several state legislatures. New bills passed in rapid succession, prohibiting private security from wearing military-style tactical gear unless working under direct coordination with local police. A federal task force was assembled to investigate impersonation cases and illegal use of police symbols by private contractors. The line between appearance and authority, long blurred by convenience and complacency, was being redrawn by law. At the same time, neighborhoods across the country began re-evaluating their contracts with private security firms. HOAs, once comfortable outsourcing control to third parties with vague promises of safety, were now on the defensive. Residents demanded transparency. Contracts were audited, terminated, or renegotiated with stronger terms. Where once private guards patrolled in silence, now neighborhood safety committees brought together local residents, law enforcement liaisons, and conflict resolution professionals. The result wasn't just safer communities, it was more inclusive, educated, and connected ones. The woman whose professionalism diffused the entire situation remained deliberately out of the spotlight. But her impact was undeniable. Law enforcement agencies quietly incorporated her response into their training modules. Community organizations referred to her actions as a reminder that courage wasn't about domination, it was about discipline. Leadership didn't require loud declarations or theatrical shows of force. It required clarity, calm under pressure, and a deep understanding of responsibility. In recognition of the broader consequences of the case, civil liberty watchdogs began publishing public databases tracking abuses by private security firms. Journalists used these databases to investigate patterns of racial profiling, over-policing in low-crime neighborhoods, and connections between certain firms and political donors. As the information became public, pressure mounted for systemic change. What was once brushed off as a one-off incident became a well-documented symptom of a national problem. The fallout from the Travis incident also highlighted a legal gray area many communities had ignored. Since HOAs are private entities, many assumed they were above public standards of governance. But courts began ruling that, when private enforcers brandish weapons or detain individuals, they cross into the domain of state power, and with that comes constitutional accountability. Fourth Amendment protections, due process rights, and equal protection clauses suddenly applied where they hadn't before. Legal precedent was shifting in real time, reshaping how HOAs operated and what limits were placed on their enforcement arms. Within Westfield Oaks itself, the transformation continued. The new HOA board, elected after the scandal, committed to full transparency. Monthly meetings were open and recorded. Budget allocations were published online. Community surveys guided every major decision. Residents were no longer passive stakeholders, they were active participants in shaping the safety and culture of their neighborhood. A young mother who once feared letting her children walk alone to the mailbox was now chairing the new Safety and Outreach Committee. A retired black veteran who had been racially profiled by the former guard helped draft new policies on anti-discrimination training for all contractors. Former skeptics began to trust each other. The old culture of silence had been broken. In its place, conversations about justice, race, and community accountability flourished. Across the country, media outlets continued referencing the case when reporting similar abuses. The term Westfield Standard emerged in think tank discussions and policy proposals, shorthand for holding private entities to public accountability when they act with public authority. The story had become a benchmark, not just because it was dramatic, but because it exposed something fragile about modern American communities, the false security of appearances, and the urgent need to protect citizens from those who weaponize power without legitimacy. What made the story resonate wasn't just the confrontation itself, but what it revealed about the everyday power structures hiding in plain sight. How someone with no training, no legal authority, and no sense of accountability could gain control over a neighborhood simply by dressing the part. And how easily that illusion could shatter when confronted by someone who truly understood the law, not just as a tool of control, but as a code of conduct. The woman's presence that day had reminded an entire nation that real strength doesn't need to posture. It doesn't rely on intimidation. It shows up, assesses the threat, neutralizes it with precision, and holds systems accountable when they fail. Her calm command wasn't just tactical, it was moral. And that tone carried forward in how the country began to talk about neighborhood power, safety, and justice. By the end of the year, multiple awards and commendations were quietly issued by federal agencies to those who had advocated for reform in the wake of the incident. But for most of those affected, the real reward was the shift in culture. It wasn't about punishing one man or suing one HOA. It was about reclaiming the right to feel safe without being surveilled. To live with dignity, without arbitrary enforcement. To raise families in neighborhoods built on cooperation, not control. The fake security badge had been stripped away. But what replaced it was something far more powerful, a shared understanding that real authority isn't something you wear. It's something you earn, protect, and never misuse. And when someone does misuse it, there must be consequences. Not just for justice, but for progress. And that's how one moment of arrogance met a lifetime of training, discipline, and truth. A man with a fake badge thought he could bully his way into power. But what he didn't know was that justice doesn't flinch. It doesn't scream. It doesn't pull weapons in fear. It stands firm. It speaks once. And it does not miss. What happened that day wasn't just about one security guard or one community. It was about a broken system that gave authority to the wrong hands. And a woman who reminded the world what real authority looks like. Because when the line between safety and control gets blurred, someone has to draw it sharp again. So, the next time someone flashes a badge and raises their voice, ask yourself, are they protecting you, or pretending to? If this story moved you, share it. Because silence keeps people like him in power. But truth? Truth brings them to the pavement, where they belong. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that expose, inspire, and remind us. Power is nothing without principle. And justice always has the last word.